Chairman and distinguished guests. My name is Jay Koo. I'm the director of the U.S.-Korea Institute here at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. On behalf of the U.S.-Korea Institute and Intermedia, I welcome you to a discussion on the state of information penetration into North Korea, as well as the North Korean regime's efforts to block, counter, and control the information coming into North Korea. Today's discussion is based on Intermedia's latest report, Compromising Connectivity, Information Dynamics Between the State and Society in a Digitizing North Korea, which is a follow-up report to A Quiet Opening. And we're delighted to welcome back Mr. Nat Kretchen, one of our stellar graduates of the Korea Studies program, and the author of the new report, along with Mr. Seamus Tuohy, the co-author of the report. And I would like to thank General Walter Sharp for participating as a former UN commander and US RFK Combined Forces commander. We had the pleasure of having him participate in 2013 of our Congressional Hill event commemorating the 60th anniversary of the Korean War armistice. Nice to see you again, sir. Since working on North Korean issues professionally back in 2005, there has been a real sea change in information penetration into North Korea. Back then, when I headed the North Korea Human Rights Project at Freedom House, when we talked about information getting in and out of North Korea, most analysts were very skeptical of the reliability of the information, the kind of information going in and coming out, the technology that we used getting information in and out were, I think, also cumbersome. I mean, this was the era of the VHS and VHS tapes and probably CD at best. And North Korean refugees, while they were coming out in droves, did not have the kind of network in North Korea to get both money and information in and out of North Korea. But in the past decade, information going in and coming out have proliferated, and we're now able to document this because of the kind of great work Intermedia has done. And as a result, we are able to piece together a much more sophisticated look into North Korea. And I really look forward to today's discussion. And so now I turn to Ms. Betsy Henderson, Director of Research at Radio Free Asia, to say a few words. Betsy?
Thank you, Jay. Thanks to SAIS's U.S.-Korea Institute for inviting me to kick off this event. I'm really happy to be here with my North Korea research colleagues to discuss the new report, Compromising Connectivity, Information Dynamics Between the State and Society in a Digitizing North Korea, which many of you have on your laps right now. This report builds on many, many years of research and picking away at media developments in one of the most inaccessible research environments on the planet. And Nat Kretchen, the main author, has been picking away at this for many, many years. I'm very happy that Radio Free Asia's oversight body, the Broadcasting Board of Governors, permitted us to share our data from RFA, from our survey of 350 defectors and refugees with Intermedia, to help produce this excellent report. I thought I'd take a short opportunity to share a little background and context for the report that Nat and Seamus are going to be talking about. I started work on North Korea research in 1999. RFA had been on the air in Korean for a little over 2 years at that point, when I was given what appeared to be an impossible task: find a way to learn about and document RFA's impact and get information to help RFA be more effective. At the time, as Jay mentioned, there was not quite as much information around, and the Washington consensus was that all media devices in North Korea were locked to official stations, which they are by law, and anyone who got their hands on a tunable radio or television knew exactly what would happen to them if they got caught. So they didn't listen to RFA or any outside stations, period. That was the consensus. Then again, perhaps a handful of top elites did. Nobody really knew. Fortunately, when I came to this task, the BBG was increasing its commitment to research and putting resources behind it. And also, fortunately, I was able to work with Intermedia Survey Institute, the producer of this report, who had a long history of research for Radio Free Europe during the Cold War, and that provided considerable perspective for this very difficult job. It was my great good fortune to be in a position to delve into North Korea at this critical and actually quite awful time, when more and more North Koreans had left their country because of famine. Borders had become more porous, and eyes and ears that had been closed for so long were just starting to open up to the outside world. Honestly, it was the most riveting work I've ever done. It was incredible to witness. Here's the sort of thing we heard from people who listened to foreign radio under their thick quilts in 1999. I knew my husband listened secretly, but I never said anything to him. I think my husband knew that I listened, but he didn't say anything either. We pretended that we didn't know about each other. I thought it was safer not to ask my children if they listened. And then comparable to this was another quote. Even my wife didn't know that I listened to it in North Korea. If we got divorced, we'd have nothing to do with each other. That's why I needed to be careful. If she had bad feelings towards me, she could say something to the authorities. Gradually, we learned that more about media itself. We started asking more about media itself. We learned how relatives in Japan sent radios and other media to North Korea, how technically clever people broke the seals on their fixed channel radios and TVs. We talked to elites and common people and young people, and we heard some really awful stories about what had happened to people who were detected using illegal media. The clear message was that motivated North Koreans were seeking outside entertainment and information in spite of the fear. Of course, in the early 2000s, most North Korean defectors not only had not accessed outside media back home, many had never heard anything beyond the party line or rumors that were their number one source of news and information, and actually remain the number one source of news and information for most North Koreans. Their responses to RFA's program showed it. They couldn't understand a lot of the terms, they were bewildered by many of the topics, and they were shocked by how outsiders dropped the honorifics in discussing North Korea's great and dear leaders. We adjusted our programs accordingly, not with the honorifics, but at least so we could be understood. Gradually, these early projects began to point to the critically important role of China in providing inspiration, information, and media equipment to North Koreans. Chinese nationals in North Korea, North Koreans who had been to China, North Koreans who had accessed Chinese Korean language media, they were an important part of the word of mouth network. And sometimes those same people brought illegal media devices, and a lot of people started making money off of it, especially the illegal DVDs that Jay mentioned, mostly of South Korean entertainment. And we started to see a change in people's reactions to programming, and they clearly understood more. As one 35-year-old laborer from Hamgyongbukdo told us, no one would have believed these stories in 1997, but many more people have now experienced life outside North Korea. So the number of people believing the stories would increase. So we started our more quantitative surveys in 2003 and have commissioned regular surveys, mostly through Intermedia, since then, later adding travelers and refugees to the mix. And we expanded our scope and improved the research methods every year, largely with the advice of our researchers in the field. The surveys have attracted a lot of attention. I'm sure you'll find the data in this report fascinating. But we never would have known what to ask if we didn't talk to people first and constantly rejigger our questionnaires. North Korean defectors and refugees, like those refugees from the Soviet bloc or from China's Cultural Revolution before them, have sometimes been treated with a lot of skepticism, but they offer important windows into that country. The seemingly non-representative anecdote, the person who says something a little different from the last round of interviews, can actually be incredibly important. It's that needle in the haystack sometimes who gives you the question that you want to ask the next time around. Whether it's the cell phone owner in 2002, the thumb drive user in 2009, or the SD card user who has foreign videos on it in 2013. They suggest the avenues for future study, and I'm sure this study is not going to be the end of it. It's going to suggest more things we need to be doing. Of course, our surveys use convenience samples, what the so-called convenience samples, which is the term described, the respondent group for our incredibly inconvenient surveys. This means that none of our surveys are representative. They tend to overrepresent the border regions and have more women than men. And all of these people, of course, have left the country, most of them permanently. But given the constraints that probably many of you in the room are well familiar with, there's no way researchers in North Korea can follow standard operating procedures for survey methodology. However, over time, we have consistencies among demographically similar groups. And Nat, it's very useful to have Nat here because he's been looking at this over time. And so if he says a sentence, there's plenty in the background that he could tell you about. Which brings me to my final point, which is that all the data in the world is worthless without a great analyst, one who understands Korean history and research methods, one who has great education, as he got here at SAIS, one who has good sense, creativity, empathy, very important, intellectual curiosity, language skills, and a passion for the work. So that pretty much describes Nat, who is also humble. And I'd like to turn it over to him now.
So just quick, so I'm Jenny Tan. I'm the Assistant Director here at the U.S. Korea Institute at SAIS. I'll be moderating today's session. And I just wanted to give a couple little introductory remarks and just kind of talk a little bit about, since the famine era of the 1990s, we've been following a lot of trends in North Korea society. Some disturbing trends, such as the Human Rights Front, and some more promising, such as the rise and role of markets in North Korea and the effects they're having on the social values and organization. And there are many tools that we've used to do this, especially in the markets. So for instance, everything from satellite imagery to official North Korean media to anecdotal evidence, both from defectors as well as people who come in and out of North Korea. And over the past decades, we've been watching what some would consider kind of a slow technology revolution. And we've studied and documented the impact of radio broadcasting, such as VOA, RFA, such as what Ms. Henderson was talking about, and that has been a big part of that process. And in the past few years, we've seen a proliferation of cell phones and other small personal technology gadgets, per se. And US Korea Institute, we did do a report a few years ago talking about the telecommunications boom in North Korea. But we still don't have a good handle on the size, scope, and pace of this seemingly technology revolution. And I feel like this is what this report really attempts to do, is really examine these questions of what technology is available, how people are using it, how the government is adapting and changing to this changing information dynamic as well. And so the overall goal of looking at what the overall goal of looking at what the implications are domestically and also for us in the external international community. So we're very pleased to have 3 speakers with us, including Nat, who is one of our SAIS alumni, as everyone has alluded to, and we're very proud of him and proud to have him back. And he's done a lot of work on this, including, again, the first report on the quiet opening. And so it's great to see sort of the evolution not only of his career, but also of the type of information, the breadth of information, the depth of information we've been able to glean from various sources. We're also very pleased to have with us Seamus Tui, who is the principal consultant at Prudent Innovation and the co-author of this report, and we'll really discuss more of the technology side of things. and of course, General Walter Sharp, who is the former commander of the UN Command and U.S. Forces Korea, and we're very pleased to have him as a discussant today to talk more about the impact of information in closed societies. And so with that, now I'll turn over to Matt.
Thank you very much, Jenny and Betsy and Jay for the introductions. Thanks to SAIS and the U.S. Korea Institute and Intermedia for helping make both the report and this event possible. And as well to the BBG, who very kindly let us use a lot of the data that actually comprises some of the statistics you'll see in the report. The report we're gonna go through today is a relatively dense one, and so I thought I might start by just trying to walk everyone through some of the kind of key findings in the main narrative, and then we'll allow our esteemed discussants to kind of add some additional context and tell you guys hopefully why this stuff is important. So perhaps somewhat anticlimactically, when it comes to North Korea research, I always like to start with the caveats. And Betsy did a great job kind of setting that up for us. But while I think this research is incredibly important and tells us a lot, and in many ways is some of the best information we're able to gather on this topic, there's also things to keep very firmly in mind. The samples for the quantitative surveys are non-representative. There are percentages in here. They cannot be assumed to represent the national populations of North Korea. As Betsy alluded to, refugee populations may be different in some way than those who stayed. I think there's some reasons in defector refugee dynamics to think that maybe refugees and defectors are actually becoming slightly better proxies for your quote-unquote normal North Korean. You know, a lot more of them are regular folks who are seeking kind of better lives abroad rather than people who are leaving for kind of political reasons. Still, you know, what separates someone who kind of voted with their feet and left versus someone who did not is something we'll never be able to kind of quantify with a methodology like this. Interviews are often conducted under adverse circumstances, which of course can have an effect on the kind of answers we get, though we do, you know, try our best to make sure that questions are very specifically tailored to the folks who will be answering them. And of course, responses are likely to be time sensitive. We can't interview folks who are still there. These people have left the country, and that means that even people who've left relatively recently may have a somewhat dated understanding of what's going on. And it's easy to map new narratives over kind of old facts in some ways. That said, when we're looking at a topic like information in North Korea, and especially when we're approaching it from a perspective like this, where we're simply asking kind of the minutia of their day-to-day lives in terms of what kind of devices, content did they have access to, we have some hope that, that it's relatively accurate and informative to folks who are interested in the topic. So without going too far back into ancient history, I think we can kind of break down the evolution, oh, that's a little nicer, the evolution of the North Korean information environment into roughly kind of 3 eras. We have an initial era, kind of high Kim Il-sungism, where there was a really near complete information blockade. Very little got in or out, and the kind of broad-based human security networks that were set up functioned relatively well. These are represented by some of the quotes that Betsy read of people who, the you know, minority of people who were getting some sort of foreign information were doing so with tons of precautions, in secret, were scared to talk about it even with their family and friends. However, as most North Korea watchers will tell you, the famine of the mid-late 90s really changed a lot of things and kind of created a lot of dynamics that came to define what the North Korean society and economy looks like more and more these days. And so a quiet opening kind of documented, I think, that era in terms of the breakdown of some of the security systems, the relatively porous border with China as people move back and forth to trade and devices and content flowed in, and people's ability to access and share far more information and gain access to far more media. And while that while that was a kind of very important development, it was also kind of messy and ad hoc. It was definitely the result of kind of a systemic breakdown rather than a kind of purposeful development. But what we're going to be talking about mostly today, and what the report focuses on, is something that we're kind of calling an emerging digitization. And this period is kind of difficult to characterize because not only is it relatively complex, there's kind of dynamics that seem to be somewhat contradictory, and it's unclear yet exactly how they'll play out. But also, it is very much emerging. We see kind of new technologies coming to the fore and new developments on the North Korean government side that tell us a lot about what the future may look like, but that future has kind of not come to be yet. So we will tell you more or less what we found out, and then hopefully our panelists can help us think a little bit more about what that may mean going forward. So walking through, we'll talk a little bit about a digitization process, both kind of a bottom-up process that we've seen in non-networked digital device expansion, things like USBs and NOTELs. We'll talk about mobile phone proliferation, which is an interesting example of a kind of top-down, introduced by the government digitization. We'll look at some of the state responses to dynamics in the information environment, kind of what it looks like they're moving toward in terms of a new vision of the information environment, specialization of human security, which really seems focused on cracking down on the foreign media that North Koreans are able to access, and then some of the more technologically advanced elements, the introduction of automated censorship and surveillance tools kind of baked into some of these new devices. And then we'll try to end on a slightly more optimistic note and talk about kind of what the state is seeding in terms of some of the interpersonal connections and the new social organization dynamics that seem to be evolving. So we'll start with kind of a dynamic that has very much continued since that post-famine opening, kind of a quiet opening period, which essentially is a continued expansion of both the breadth and the depth of access to media devices. Some of the more traditional, relatively less sensitive media devices are now approaching near ubiquity. TVs, DVD players are in most homes. Nearly all homes. And people, use them in a variety of ways, both for kind of sanctioned and illegal purposes. And you'll see that it really is quite a range of things, and a lot that we have, only started to track in recent years, things like SD and micro SD cards, which, previously we didn't see much of, and now are starting to show up quite consistently in samples. If we look at the dynamics over time, the two kind of most important things to note are, do we have a little pointer? All right. For some of our kind of more legacy media, we see growth, but with the nature of the survey, we'll think of a relatively stable line around things like shortwave radio, and where we see the most kind of dramatic growth is in things like USB thumb drives and in mobile phones. And so that certainly is indicative of some of the digitization that we see going on in the media environment. It's probably worth considering how, because North Korea is such an interesting context, how some of these devices are being used, how North Koreans are actually able to make use of these things. So when we're talking about things like NOTELs, these attached screen DVD players that are quite popular in North Korea, USB drives, they get strung together in very ingenious ways in kind of non-networked systems. So we have kind of a little mock-up representation of one. It's essentially, you have a cell phone, but there's no access to internet, and cellular data is limited to a few very specific use cases, like reading the Nodong Chingmun. So not exactly super useful in terms of getting media or exchanging files or things. But what you do have is you have micro SD to USB converters, which is essentially a cheap piece of plastic that you can get from China and has kind of spread quite rapidly in North Korea. And then that allows you to use your DVD player, which has direct USB inputs, to kind of move files between all these devices. And allows for much greater both ability to share files and also to kind of view them in whatever way is most convenient, most safe, and kind of most expedient given the difficulty of accessing illegal media in North Korea. The way that the state seems to be responding to these developments, the proliferation of some of these new digital devices, because many of them are not like explicitly illegal, but they are widely used for illegal things. USB drives, there are sanctioned uses for them in a place where you don't have internet. If you want to take a file from work home to your computer, you need a flash drive. However, most folks that we have surveyed, interviewed, they use them for South Korean dramas, illegal K-pop, all sorts of kind of non-sanctioned purposes. And that's over 90% of those who said they had a USB are using them at least for some measure of illegal activity. And so the North Koreans have had to find new ways to try to crack down on what they know are unsanctioned uses of these technologies. And it seems like in the wake of the kind of breakdown of some of the mass mobilization security networks, essentially your neighbors no longer reporting on one another, people being much more susceptible to bribes, what they've done is constitute some kind of specially tasked units that are essentially looking for these specific crimes. In recent years, a group called 109, Group 109, has come up again and again in interviews with recent refugees and defectors, and they are after specific ideological infractions, mostly around foreign media. They are much more difficult to bribe, probably not impossible, but more difficult, and really have helped spur a resensitization of some of what we thought of as relatively innocuous outside media, like Korean dramas. Up until essentially the start of the Kim Jong-un era, we saw that the way people talked about outside media mirrored increasing access to it. So they spoke of it as being less sensitive. You would like invite the neighbors over to watch a drama. Everyone watched dramas. These behaviors were becoming normalized. And now that seems to kind of be receding as you see a concerted government effort to crack down on some of these things. And when we talked to survey respondents, none of them said it was less dangerous than in the past to access dramas in foreign media. One of the most interesting developments that we have seen in the North Korean information environment that really, I think, caused a lot of folks to scratch their head, it was the legal introduction of mobile phones. They tried this in the early 2000s once, and then they reintroduced them again in 2008, this time, it turns out, in earnest. And for a regime that has spent so much effort on isolating its population as part of a control strategy, it seems quite counterintuitive to introduce quite powerful communication technologies. And so there was a lot of skepticism initially about who are these going to be for, why are they doing this? Like, obviously there could be economic benefits to introducing technologies like this, but they have to be aware of the security potentials, the security risks. Maybe they're only going to be for a handful of elites. But we saw Orascom, the kind of joint partner provider of the first cell phones in 2008. Their supply side statistics showed over 3 million subscriptions by the time they were eventually forced out of the country and no longer retained control of that. And increasingly in our own surveys, we found that those looked like credible numbers. In the 2015 BBG Refugee Defector and Traveler Survey, we found that respondents from every province had used domestic legal mobile phones. And this looks similar across other demographics as well. Those who were not super economically well off, women, folks in rural areas as well as urban areas, they're not so cheap and so accessible that everyone has them, but they are no longer simply kind of just for a core elite or just for those in Pyongyang. And we found that because they were legal, people were using basically everything that their cell phone could do. Previous to the introduction of legal domestic cell phones, we looked a lot at illegal Chinese cell phones that use along the border for smuggling and trading and other things. And generally, those were used in very narrow ways. You made 30-second calls and you got off the phone because you didn't want to get in trouble. It wasn't worth kind of playing around with your phone to see what else it could do when it was so dangerous. However, with a legal phone, you can take all the time you want to toy around on it, figure out what you can do, and it really has increased vastly the way that folks use these. So this is what have you done with a legal mobile phone, and you see there is quite a range of activities, text messaging, taking photos, sending and receiving photos, videos, sending other files. The phones, until recently, as we'll talk about, were Bluetooth capable. People were able to pass around files. The phones provided a really nice central interface and hub for a lot of those non-network systems we were talking about. And to kind of underline that, we see that when we ask people who had a micro SD card how they used it, most of them used it through their domestic mobile phones. And this makes a lot of sense when your phone is at any time up for kind of physical inspection. You can very easily have the stuff you don't want discovered on a micro SD that you are easily able to take out of your phone, and so your phone looks clean when someone physically inspects it. And it underlines that nice ability for North Koreans to find ways to keep themselves safe and share and consume media with the technologies they have. However, around late 2013, early 2014, it's hard to date exactly, it seems like the North Korean authorities were able to respond to some of what was going on with the cell phones in a really pretty ingenious and effective way with the introduction of a new mobile operating system that contained a whole lot of software. One portion of which is kind of referred to as the signature system by North Koreans who are somewhat technically knowledgeable. And basically what it meant was that no unsanctioned files or media could be used on these phones. They would immediately detect the presence of any files being introduced, not allow them to be loaded, and in some cases they would actually be automatically deleted. Which, made us immediately then kind of raise that question again. Were the North Koreans really rushing into expanding cell phone access in a kind of ad hoc or ill-considered way? And clearly the answer is no. When we look at kind of the different levels at which they attempted to control mobile phones, from the start we were aware of network level controls. There's no international calling, cellular data, as we said, is very limited, not particularly great use cases. And the fact that they're on the networks open them up to all sorts of surveillance. And then you have your traditional human controls, the physical inspections that would continue to go on. People's homes could be raided at any point. They could be stopped on the street to have their cell phones inspected. What initially was kind of what engendered a nice grace period where people were able to use their phones to access foreign media and do a lot more was the fact that the device level controls were relatively weak. There wasn't near as much there. People were able to use them as hubs for illegal media. However, with the introduction of new mobile operating systems and the signature system, that was effectively shut off very quickly. And so by looking at software solutions on the device level, they were really able to create a much more locked down and clean kind of digital environment. This is kind of a quick mock-up of how some of these signature permissions work, but basically it's any file that you're going to be using on a North Korea computer or Android, the phones or tablets or anything, is going to need to have either a national signature that comes from the government, or we'll have to have a self-signature, basically a file that's created on the device itself. And those self-signatures, it doesn't appear as though they are transferable between devices. And so that makes it really difficult to introduce essentially any unsanctioned new foreign things into this digital environment. And as we discovered, it's not just cell phones. These things are under development for the tablets, for computers, for anything else that could potentially kind of have a network connection. which on the one hand begs the question, are North Koreans preparing for kind of a greater network expansion via something like their domestic intranet, if they're creating computers and tablets which aren't utilizing cellular data but could use something like the intranet? It definitely demonstrates the authorities' reactive capacity in terms of like both recognizing what's going on the ground, and being able to respond to it quite effectively. But I think it also gives us some insight into essentially the vision of a much more technologically advanced, but no less controlled, very clean digital media environment that they're working toward, where basically the only thing that's allowed to kind of flow through these devices are things that have been sanctioned and approved. And so that is a relatively daunting picture when we think about a government that has quite a large technological advantage over its own people, and is able to kind of implement a very clean networked digital ecosystem, and then can take the resources it's saving basically by doing that in an automated or centralized fashion and apply those to kind of plugging holes, be it on the border or through your no-tells that exist outside of that network system. But there still are reasons, silver linings and reasons to be a little more hopeful. And this is one I think that is important to underline. When we ask folks in North Korea how do they obtain both staple foods and consumer goods, they are all getting what they need from the market. They are trading with one another, they are kind of interacting in market ways, and as a result, it would be very difficult for the North Korean government to kind of take away some of these communication technologies that have been introduced and that are really helping to facilitate a lot of these market interactions. And on the kind of information side, while it may be becoming much more difficult to load, say, unsanctioned media files onto a phone, in a closed information environment like North Korea, word of mouth, folks talking to one another, remains North Koreans' most important and kind of up-to-date source of information. And so catalyzing those word-of-mouth networks with digital communication technology is far from trivial. That's a really important development, even as the regime is clearly innovating on censorship and surveillance technologies. Finally, it's important to remember, how much this is solidifying those horizontal connections between North Koreans. While it's clear that the government had a plan with how it was going to create a modern yet very locked down media environment, the communication space is really kind of supercharged and now solidifying. North Koreans are able to talk to each other over much greater geographic distances and be connected to each other much more instantaneously than previously. And that, in a slightly longer outlook, you can imagine being some of the early kind of green shoots of something that resembles a little more something like civil society, where because people are much less isolated from one another, they're able to have kind of recognize each other's shared interests in some way. And so, while I generally like relatively obtuse titles like compromising connectivity, I think it's somewhat apt here, as we see that North Koreans, as they move into this kind of digitally networked space, are definitely compromising some of their own security and privacy that they had, as the security system broke down. But at the same time, the North Korean government truly is beginning to compromise with its own citizens in negotiating some of the norms by allowing technologies like cell phones to be used. And so with that, I will turn it over to Seamus to maybe dig into a little more of the tech side of things and give us some kind of international perspective. Thanks.
So I will do my best to not go so deep into the tech that everyone falls asleep. You can feel free to read through the dense report. We talk a lot more about that in there. Our approach with examining the tech was essentially very much so like an archaeological experiment. We had access to 2 mobile phones that actually predated a recently reverse-engineered mobile phone that was presented at the Chaos Communications Congress. and therefore had a history of code in those devices. We also went and looked at the operating system that is the desktop operating system for Linux. And then, of course, did all of this within the context that Nat provided, giving us a very interesting exploration of the kind of human side of this tech and how this tech told a story about control and access for the future as we saw bits of code being introduced and modified in these systems over time. I'm going to also try to focus a little bit more on the systems of control in relationship to the tech as opposed to jumping deep into the mobile phones and what they were called and what the APKs were named. And so in the mechanisms of control we saw, there were essentially two forms. There was the mosquito net methodology of actually censoring and purging illicit content. And this was found on all the devices and is also on the network level. And then there is a secondary level, which is the attack the network style model of actually trying to identify dissidents and information sharing and purging those elements of society instead of just the content itself, severing the ability to share content and identifying who is sharing content. And all of this is wrapped in this layer of trying to ensure the integrity of this control. Obviously, if these systems break down, it's not really worth much. And this control happens on 3 layers. And as Nat pointed out, the network layer, on the device layer, and also on that human layer. So in most countries around the world where you have censorship and surveillance, this often happens at the network layer. Especially automated surveillance happens at the network layer. And this is done through either the devices themselves by monitoring traffic that goes over them or blocking traffic that goes over them, or it's actually done through the intermediaries. This is the asking Facebook to remove illicit content or Google to remove illegal movies. And it is easier to automate. And it works really well in a very highly connected society, but it requires a lot of work tracking down this information. And so if you don't have the infrastructure to automate the actual identification of content that is negative, it becomes harder and harder and harder. Device and human level surveillance in most countries, in many countries, and there are obviously exceptions, is much more a targeted activity. When you're going to actually go into someone's device, you have to compromise that device. And that means either using malware, targeted attacks against them, like phishing attacks that load viruses on their device and give you control, or it requires actually going into the supply chain itself and compromising chips and the like that go into these devices so you have kind of constant access. This is the idea of putting in those the backdoors that allow you to get access to specific devices. It's a complex process because it is not a government-sanctioned activity in most regions. North Korea is actually operating on all 3 of these levels in a way that is not more advanced, but it's more invasive and pervasive than most other regions. So if we look at the network level first, the network level was obviously the first to be built out. And is very much so a switchboard model of surveillance. There are individuals who are monitoring the conversations, the text messages, and the like. If you are a government worker who's using the internet, after the months it takes you to actually get access and going through the metal detectors and getting on a computer that's significantly throttled, so it's actually hard to load pages at all, there is for every 100-ish people on that internet, someone in a room watching every one of those computers and turning them off if something illicit or unexpected happens based off what they're supposed to be doing. There are definitely moves towards automation. We heard some narratives around how they're trying to push out to actually automate some of these network level processes, monitoring for illicit messages and texts, monitoring for conversations on phone calls, and actually transmitting that to text so that they can block that. And there were hints that there might already be text-based monitoring, but we have no real hard evidence that that's actually happening at this point. And so for the citizen level, you do have people literally sitting in rooms looking at walls of text messages and listening to recordings. As you move up towards government level surveillance and people who have a wider range of access and a wider range of devices, the surveillance becomes much more pervasive. And so this is actually having multiple people look at the emails you're sending and very visibly rejecting those emails and sending you back a message that's handwritten saying, we're sorry, we can't send that email for you. And so that's the network level. It's still very much so human-centered, but moving towards greater automation. The device level is, in my opinion, the most interesting of these 3. So the North Korean devices, the operating system is controlled by the government. The best equivalent I can imagine is Apple. Apple has what we'd call a closed ecosystem. If you get an Apple device, you have to download Apple apps from the App Store that have been approved and signed. The national signature that Nat mentioned is almost exactly like the Apple signature to sign those apps that are allowed to be loaded on your phone. They've taken this one step further with the self-signature, which actually signs all the videos you take on your phone and the photos you take on the phone, and they have Word documents on your computer, so you type a Word document. The challenge there is, of course, you can't then share that Word document with anyone else because their phone doesn't recognize your signature. And this actually happens on the app layer currently. Previously, it was kind of shuffled off to a different system, but now if you design an app that's going to go onto a North Korean phone, you have to put these controls in place. You have to say, when I open up a Word document, I check the signature first, and if it works, if it's an authentic signature, either national or it's my self-signed, I open it up. If it doesn't work, I won't open that file. And then they also, of course, have systems within these devices that look for signed and unsigned files and will delete those immediately. Mostly on events, like I plug a SD card into my phone, it then, new SD card, it reads all the files in the SD card, it finds ones that aren't signed and deletes those files. The national signature is also used not just for content that's on the devices, but the apps themselves. So every app has to go through a process of being approved, seeing that it's being used correctly, being signed, and then being put into the App Store. These applications check for specific types of applications, Angry Birds being one of those, which is totally okay. And it checks to make sure that you're on this whitelist of approved applications on these devices. Okay, so the next kind of layer on the devices, which is really intriguing, is the integrity controls. So as we've seen with the censorship and the censorship on these devices, it operates very much like an antivirus would, looking for apps, checking those apps, ensuring those apps are actually getting through and they're appropriate. The integrity systems are a much more aggressive version of this same censorship system. What they're actually doing is they're looking at apps that are properly signed, that should be on the device, and seeing if they've been modified in any way. If those devices are modified, it'll shut down the device, it'll delete files. It's very much so a scorched earth approach to integrity controls, as it not just tries to protect the device from being changed, and these signatures kind of authenticate these files as the appropriate file. It'll also start shutting down your device and restarting. And you'll end up in this restart loop where every time it restarts, it checks to make sure the files are correct, but they weren't correct. That's why it shut down in the first place. And so it restarts again. And so therefore forcing you to reinstall the OS or take it in for repairs. It's a very intense system for if anything is out of whack, just shut it down and don't let it run anymore. This then brings us to the surveillance infrastructure on these devices, which is doing what is kind of a counterintuitive set of controls. This attack the network style approach and the mosquito net style approach, mosquito net being we don't let in any bad content, and therefore we delete it immediately, we don't let it on the devices, versus the attack the network style approach, which you need to know what's been loaded on the device, you need to know who's loading what devices, you need to let certain amounts of information distribute throughout the society to then identify what these networks look like, and then sever these networks at key points. And so we see the signature system operates in actually two ways. We have the signatures on the content and on the devices, the natural signature and the signature of the user. But we also have signing of content that gets loaded on these devices. And so we saw in the code actually new content that was put on devices that wasn't deleted. There was a series of systems that would sign it with your device identifier. And then as it gets passed on to new devices, it would then add on the other signatures, creating a social network, so that if those devices or that content was confiscated, you could see everyone who has shared this piece of content. This is actually implemented in the Red Star OS. We did not see this implemented fully in the mobile devices. But the interesting kind of challenge here is that if content's supposed to be deleted immediately upon being put on your device, but it's also being signed in this very intriguing way to identify these networks of information distribution, it seems kind of out of whack. It doesn't seem to fit. But it does start to make sense when you start to look at the surveillance infrastructure they're putting in place on the devices for the human level controls. So on the human level, obviously, as Nat was saying, there's a long history of using human level controls. They're very effective, they're very dispersed. There's both the street level policing, but also the community level policing of others, actually saying, well, I think they have a bunch of illegal content. One of the components that makes human-level controls so difficult is maintaining the integrity of human-level controls is incredibly hard. Bribery is widespread, there's significant resource limitations, and so the way to support them is to provide them tools to do this more effectively. Currently, if someone asks for your phone, you provide them your phone, the SD card's not in your phone, and so they look at a phone that's essentially empty. One of the apps that we saw in development and then implemented on these devices is something called Trace Viewer. Trace Viewer is essentially a screenshot app and a browser history app, except for you can't delete the content. Everything you do in your browser is recorded. Your screenshots are taken every time you open an app and throughout while you're using an app. When you insert an SD card or remove an SD card, it logs the files that are on that SD card and takes screenshots of what you're doing. What this does is it creates an ongoing archive. Now, it doesn't have a delete function. It does have an export function, though. So if you plug in a device and say export, it'll export your entire history of all of that. This makes it a lot easier to then confiscate a device, export the content, and then sanction later. It doesn't require that investigation on the street, in the alleyway, when there's a group of kids walking home from school and they're all annoying and they're yelling and they're having fun and you're trying to get all their phones and check to make sure they're not doing things that are illicit. This codification of the human-level controls in the device-level controls provides a far greater ability for actually attacking these networks as it is. Because also it does record those files before they're deleted. And that is my time. And if you should definitely read the report, there's a lot more fun stuff in there. Oh, sorry, can I do 5 minutes on comparative, by the way? I know I was supposed to. Is that right? So comparing this to other societies that do censorship and surveillance, I get really excited about the tech stuff and I ramble. So I think the resource constraints and the intense focus on human-level controls makes North Korea a unique surveillance and censorship kind of landscape when it comes to technology. There are equivalent landscapes. Cuba is a very good corollary on that resource constraints, reliance on human-level controls, and the use of limited access to the internet and limited access to networks and speed of networks as essentially a buffer mechanism as they built up their surveillance and censorship capabilities. We've seen, obviously, the widespread build-out of the Wi-Fi networks throughout Cuba very recently. We've seen them open up greater and greater access to connectivity. This also came with their version of network-level controls, which was embedded in the routers themselves, in the devices at hotels, and in those Wi-Fi hotspots. Again, trying to lower the level at which this censorship is done to a much smaller area where they can have humans who are connected monitoring the activities in these Wi-Fi hotspots and saying, oh, someone's doing something illicit, I know what computer they're on, and then moving to that device. Again, this tying of the human level and then the network level surveillance and the device level surveillance really does paint a different picture. Secondly, there's obviously China, who the MosquitoNet model, the network level controls are based on. And then also Iran is another good corollary to this, which is the tech sovereignty, trying to build a localized infrastructure where you can actually build your entire internet that does all the things that an intranet should do, an internal internet should do, all the kind of features and functionality that you want from an intranet without all of the pesky other people who have different opinions and want to provide different levels of information.
Great, thank you, Seamus. And there's a lot to chew on here, so I do hope that you actually do read the report. Nat and Seamus have put a lot of work into this, and there's a lot of good information in the appendices as well that breaks down some more, especially of the monitoring infrastructure that's been done by some of our other scholars. I would like to invite General Sharp to offer some comments, talking more about why this is even important and why we care about information access in closed societies. So
Well,
please.
thank you. And first off, I'd like to thank Zeiss for allowing me to come and talk today. It's a real honor. And when Marcus Galaskis, which I'm sure many of you all know, the North Korean mission manager, called me yesterday and asked me to come, I immediately jumped at it. So thank you. And I would like to talk just briefly about what I see as the importance of this report and the opportunity that it potentially provides for us in order to be able to help force a change in North Korea, force a change to make North Korea more like the rest of the world and more obeying and following the values that the rest of the world has. So I guess I believe that there will not be change in North Korea until we have both external pressure and internal pressure to force that change. I think the external pressure is very important, needs to continue to hopefully try to continue to slow down the technological advances he's having with ballistic missiles and nuclear type of things. But I don't believe any amount of just external pressure will ever force a change in North Korea. So to me, the key part then is how do you get internal pressure? How do you try to get the people, how do the people of North Korea get educated, get confident enough to be able to try to internally force a change? And I think that's why this report is important, because it gives us some insights into what people are looking at, what types of information that they are getting, how the North Korea regime is controlling that. But I'm encouraged by the fact that, as you all point out, the number of cell phones there, and just the fact if someone in Pyongyang can talk to someone in Wonsan and share stories and all of that, even if it's just verbally, the number of USBs that are getting in and the use of USBs are increasing, even when everybody says it's more dangerous. So I'm encouraged by the fact that there is more information about the rest of the world, about truth, about human rights that's getting into North Korea. So this takes me to the main part of my brief talk here. Is, okay, if information is getting in, what type of information needs to get in to try to get to the point where the North Korea people and the regime and the middle-level folks are trying to apply enough pressure to force a change in North Korea? And I think one of the key components that, and probably in my view, the most important key component that is missing right now is a clear definition, understanding, agreement in South Korea and the U.S., and we'll start with there, but I think also we should include China, of what does a reunified peninsula really look like? I mean, what is the future for a North Korean people, for North Korean military, for North Korean elite? What is the future for them in a reunified peninsula? We've really never had this discussion get to any depth. It immediately goes to, where's U.S. troops going to be? Are they still going to be on the peninsula? And it does not get much past that. We don't talk about, okay, in a reunified peninsula, what are the property rights for the people that are in North Korea right now? What's going to happen to the North Korean military? What's going to happen to those who govern the cities right now as it goes across? And from a China perspective, and many other things, but in a China perspective, how is the border going to be controlled? Are there any rights of China inside of North Korea for all the investment that China has put in, especially along the northern border? Are there any port rights that China should be able to get? So, when I look at the opportunities of information getting in, I think that's great. I think it is going to slowly force a change in North Korea. But until the North Korean people truly believe, through information that's getting in, that there's a future for them in a reunified peninsula or a changed North Korea that is more open, that does obey more human rights, regulations and beliefs, and believes in those types of freedoms, until the people of North Korea see that there's a future for them in that and understand how they fit into that, the information that's getting in will help, but it will not get to the point of forcing a change within North Korea. So, I believe that as you look at how to force a change in countries like North Korea, but let's take North Korea specifically, there's always a balance. There's a balance between slow, stability, maintaining, they'll get there eventually, but in the case of North Korea, they're becoming more and more dangerous from a provocation perspective, from a capabilities perspective, from a human rights violation perspective. So can you stand that slow change Or do you try to force a change earlier that is more risky? Because Kim Jong-un is not stupid. He will do whatever he can to try to stop information, to try to strike out, to coalesce his people together. But where is that balance and where should we be moving? And I guess I'm of the belief that with all that's going in capability-wise, provocation-wise, human rights violation-wise in North Korea, now is the time and maybe the opportunity as we see more information getting in, but it has to be, in my view, information that is about the rest of the world, but what becomes more clear to the people of North Korea is in a changed North Korea, where is there? What's in it for them? What's in there for their future? So I think I'll stop there and again, just congratulate you all on really some information. I think as somebody pointed out at the very beginning, that I think there are still many people, policymakers in our government and in South Korea, that believe no information can get into North Korea. It's all so tightly controlled. And I think work like this proves that wrong to begin with. And I think more and more people are starting to say, okay, we can get some information in. But again, to me, it is what is the information and what is the future that's going in there. So I'll stop there, and again, thank you very much.
Great. Thank you for your remarks. I think we'll go ahead and open it up to the floor for questions. I would ask that you make sure to actually ask a question, and please identify yourself and identify who your question is directed to. Curtis, why don't we start there? Please wait for the microphone.
Good morning. Thank you for the presentation. I haven't read it yet. Obviously, I look forward to reading it, so I apologize if my question's already explained in detail in your report. You mentioned that it has a very extensive cache of activity, the cell phones do. I was actually wondering, like, if there's some way that this is, you said it's not transmitted, but it seems like that would clog up the phone memory eventually and make the phone totally unusable unless it's emptied somehow. And the second thing I was wondering is if the phones have any kind of geolocation service on them.
To answer that without answering that entirely, because again, going into the depths and trying to remember if it did have a time frame at which it kept, I think it did keep a certain amount of time of data, but I can't completely remember off the top of my head. But I do think it's important to note that a lot of the advances we've seen in both the Red Star OS, the desktop operating system, as well as in the mobile operating systems, hints at a future of a much more interconnected and networked society in which these types of things can actually be piped up and pushed into more automated systems on this device level. Currently, though, I think TraceViewer, is a really good kind of example of how they're trying to rapidly respond, knowing their current capabilities, while building towards this long-term outcome.
Thank you. Yeonho Kim, USKI at SAIS. I think the most fascinating aspect of this new report is your deep analysis of the device level surveillance. That's something I have been really seeking for. That kind of information was really enlightening, I think, in this research area. And my question is, since this device-level surveillance has been introduced at least a year ago, I guess the smart North Korean people have found some loopholes, because when it comes to this media environment in North Korea and information penetration, it has been cat and mouse game between the state and the people. So if there's any information you can share in public, I would really appreciate. And the second question is Kangsong Network. If the second mobile telecommunication network run mostly by the state has any impact on people's behavior pattern in terms of their cell phone use and, again, device level surveillance. Thank you.
You want to start, and then
No, I
I'll
was
pop
going to
in?
say, you should go first, and I'll...
Okay, and you'll hop on.
Yeah.
So on the device level surveillance, it's clear that one of the things that the authorities were counting on was a massive technological sophistication advantage over their own people. So it does seem like it would be quite difficult, and I'll let Seamus speak more specifically to that, but quite difficult to undermine the controls on the devices, given how much has been spent on integrity preservation and other things. I will say, though, that those kind of signature system device level controls came with the mobile update. And so we have had a couple anecdotal reports of people basically having a second phone that is unconnected to the network. And so if that mobile operating system is never updated, if it's not connected to the network, then it could remain an important media device without having those controls put on it. But obviously, there's probably a pretty discrete window in time, and you'd have to be quite smart to have done that in that discrete window of time. And the other question was, oh, yes. So we definitely see a lot of folks moving on to the 195 network away from the 191 network, the Orascom network. It's unclear that that has any real impact on kind of behavior patterns, and we haven't, aside from a few folks who said there's slightly kind of like regional variations and tariff differences between the two networks, we haven't seen anything that indicates they're being used in any different way.
To build off of what Nat was saying, I definitely think that I'll start with the device loopholes. I mean, we have, these devices are being built with to a certain amount, limited based off of the lack of ability to get connectivity for a lot of these developers, but still pretty robust understanding of an adversarial environment where the adversaries are hackers around the world who are trying to root Android and iPhones and circumvent these controls in much more modernized societies with a much greater amount of technical education. And so when you talk about the North Korean kind of, to put it badly, but like hacker community, people who are running secondary markets of cell phones, these types of technologists in North Korea are facing a much greater capability barrier. So they are circumventing them currently. I mean, the SD cards being pulled out of the phones when they're handing them over. These types of more human-based, more connectivity-based mechanisms are really valuable currently. The kind of Luddite wins the day as we see this moving forward, in that we see kind of the use of these old non-connected, non-network devices really do become much more safe and secure devices. As far as the behavior patterns, I think that there's, much like every society, people who don't spend all of their time every day looking at surveillance and censorship and technology develop folklore security around what works and what doesn't work based off of how they see sanctioning being applied, how they see people getting caught, and what they see as the threats that they can visualize. And by putting those together, you develop practices, which I'm sure Nat probably can go into more depth in, that are not real. They don't actually provide any security, but are much more based upon this examination of what's going on and how people are being censored and what can I possibly do to circumvent them without having the technical skill and the capacity to really dig into what is the kind of network of effects that's causing these types of sanctioning or this type of identification or triangulation of Chinese cell phones and how that actually works to happen.
Great.
Question to either Nat or Seamus. When it comes to the North Korean government surveillance monitoring technology, is it homegrown, or do they have to get this technology from abroad? And if so, how do they get that, and from where?
When we're talking about the operating system level, the device level surveillance technology, that is, well, it's built off of a lot of open source code standards, but they're also writing a lot of their own code. Looking at this code, you could actually see them developing their code over time, and this is one of the things we watched was you can trace kind of where they're headed by what they're putting in place and how they make major shifts in the code between the two versions of software that we had. The operating system that they're using, they have both a customized version of Windows, which provides a lot of the same controls, but is not very stable at all from what we've heard. And then they have this Linux version, the Red Star OS, which is more stable but doesn't run any Windows programs. And because CJK languages aren't really well supported on Linux, they're less useful for doing things like word processing and the like. So even though it has more stability, it has less utility. But that's an open source piece of software. It's based off of what we call a Red Hat Linux, which is a free and open piece of software. On the network level surveillance, obviously we have a lot less knowledge about what's going on there. One of the things that when we talk about automation, there was a university project around translating speech to text, where it was software built by a university student that they're trying to customize to put in this network. So there's obviously internal development on that scale as well, where they're innovating and trying to incorporate it into their surveillance apparatus.
Hi, my name is Jonathan. I'm from Daily NK. Thank you very much for this amazing report. I really look forward to digging in later. I have a question related to the finding that the majority of the people interviewed found that there's a more severe crackdown on consuming foreign media since Kim Jong-un came to power. What is the related response in terms of bribe prices? Do we see that bribe costs are going up? What are the range of bribes that people have to pay for different sorts of media consumption? I wonder if you can get into that a little bit.
Sure. So it's always hard to pinpoint an exact cost range. Different circumstances, different security officials who find you at different times. Those can all factor into how much you might be able to get away with. That said, we definitely have reports that bribe costs are increasing. That is becoming both just the kind of normal cost of doing business bribes that people kind of price into their economic activities, but in particular also bribes that are trying to get you out of trouble. We have seen some of the special task forces, Group 109 amongst others, who will exact much higher bribes if they'll take them at all. So yeah, it's definitely kind of something we've seen, and it's, I think initially we thought maybe it was like, oh, it's a transition thing between father to son, it'll kind of go back to everyone can watch dramas without too much worry, but it really has persisted, as far as we can tell, and has caused a resensitization of a lot of things that seemed like they were increasingly less sensitive.
Could I follow on with that question?
Please.
Increased cell phone use because of the availability, increased USB use and all of that. Did you all get into asking, of that increased use, is it all legal use? Is it how much of it is legal versus illegal? And it gets back to the question that was just asked about it's more dangerous, but things are being more used. If it's being used in a legal way, then I can kind of understand that. But if there's also increased illegal use that they'll admit to, that's, I think, a real insight.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a really interesting dynamic, particularly with cell phones. I think we know that like USBs and NoTels and a lot of these non-network devices are used very predominantly for illegal things, though people do watch, North Korean television and dramas and things. And we have seen, interestingly, a little bit more, it seems like kind of content differentiation in terms of how they're cracking down, you're not supposed to be watching Chinese dramas, but that's not near as big a deal as if you're watching South Korean dramas. On the cell phones, obviously, like, talking to one another is a legal activity. But we're very interested in kind of the amount of risk people will take over the phone lines, because most people believe that they are at least able to be monitored, if not being actively monitored. And so it's a hard question in North Korea because trading and business is generally in a kind of quasi-legal state. So lots of people conduct what would be kind of sanctionable, illegal business over the phones in a pretty open way. However, when we ask if they've ever talked about anything political in nature, it's like zeros across the board. So I think there's an understanding that if you are kind of going about your business, even if you know, like, oh, if I got caught smuggling this cement, I would get in trouble, you'll be willing to make arrangements to do that over the phone, but you wouldn't be kind of condemning the leadership or something over the phone.
Hi, my name is Alex Bloom. At the risk of this being a basic question, I'm used to using internet and talking about internet usage in China, and I don't hear, and I didn't I flipped quickly through, didn't see any mention of VPNs, and I'm curious, is anybody using VPNs on their phone or on their computer to access the internet?
Yeah, that's a difficult one. There's not a whole lot of internet availability in North Korea, which is kind of your first fundamental problem. But do you want to hop in on the kind of like...
Yeah. You have to imagine, you don't have to imagine, there are two separate networks, essentially. There's the internal, imagine this, in a world where, no, there are these two essentially separated networks. The internal network, which there's much wider access to it through, devices that are hooked up to it. It's much speedier, obviously, because it's only happening internally. And then there are specific areas you can go to get access to the external, like the internet. You're not going to see internet access in a non-public and monitored area, besides possibly in the houses of the very, very, very influential. And I don't know about that, and I could probably talk more to that.
I don't know about that either.
Yeah. The use of VPNs there's a couple of kind of core concepts there. One, which is that you have control over your device, and therefore can load a thing like a VPN on it to then access the internet. And two, the speed decrease that a VPN provides, which on a modern network with high speeds, not much. When you're already throttled to the point where a Wikipedia page takes 3 minutes to load, a VPN becomes onerous beyond belief. So that's the best I can. Oh, though I am speaking specifically for North Koreans in North Korea, like citizens, not necessarily for travelers or teachers who are coming into the country and using the networks that they're allowed to use. We didn't look at that.
Hi, thank you both for your presentation. Anna Keegan with NDI. I'm curious, recognizing, of course, that your sample is limited and non-representative, on the user end, if you could speak to any sort of general trends about demographics. Who's using mobile phones? Are they young? Are they old? Everyone in between? Gender? Some of those factors.
Sure, I can kind of start with that. On the mobile phone question, there is a relatively wide demographic spread of folks who are using mobile phones. That was one of the kind of things that initially told us, oh, these are probably getting out beyond just the kind of important top-level elites. In the report, we lay out kind of 3 kind of characterizations of users that we found kind of popped up again and again, particularly in qualitative interviews where we got to kind of get into a bit more like, why did you get a cell phone? How do you kind of use it? What does it mean to you? Sort of things. And so there's definitely folks who use it in an extremely utilitarian business sort of way. They have to arrange things with suppliers and buyers, and a cell phone makes that much easier than it would have been before that. They generally, use only calling and text messaging really, and go through a ton of airtime. They'll often have multiple phones simply because the base fare is much cheaper than adding additional minutes. But very kind of like narrow communication use cases. And then there are kind of officials for whom I think there's a lot of status symbol involved in that, folks who need to be seen, kind of project their own status and thus have to have a mobile phone. They really kind of run the gamut in terms of use patterns, where some are relatively sophisticated users who clearly are kind of like smart and interested in what these devices can do, and others it's a bit more simply a status symbol. And then finally, and most interestingly, I think, are young folks who they are the ones who kind of push the bounds of credulity in terms of, are you sure you needed to buy this cell phone most? Where, people are saving their last cent and, bugging mom and everything to get a cell phone so that they can kind of look cool and fit in with their friends. And often they are using pretty minimal airtime because that is an additional cost that they don't have money for, but they're playing games, they're like really the ones who are kind of figuring out what can I do on this cell phone, which is kind of the interesting dynamic.
Can I ask one more question?
Yeah.
Did you all get into discussion in your polls, and I apologize, I just skimmed the report last night, but on what type of information influenced the people you talked to the most? For example, what types of information convinced them they should leave North Korea? What types of information, now that they're out, what types of information is not getting into North Korea that I think would be helpful to force some change, to get into more of the quality of what's causing changes? What types of information? Did you do any of that work?
So that's something that we've been looking at for a long time on behalf of kind of radio broadcasters who are, of course, very concerned about, like, is our content resonating with our target audiences? And so we've looked at it through that window a little bit. And in general, I think you're quite right in kind of stating that the content needs to be specific to the people. Like, any story that doesn't have a connection that folks in North Korea can kind of grasp onto, that has some relation to their daily life, tends to fall pretty flat. And so it's really that kind of combination of, this is something that I understand, that I feel is relevant to my own life, be it things like, you know, the weather reports so you can make sure that your ship doesn't, you know, sink if you're going fishing, to like anything that could be a potential supply shock for your trading operations, you know, across the Chinese border. Very kind of utilitarian things, but then also just like how the outside world relates to North Korea. Not kind of outside world in kind of some general abstract sense, but you know, how it views North Korea and how specific things differ in North Korea and the outside world, I think, are the things that tend to have most resonance.
And there's another point on that is also the spread of information, which highly valuable information that might be the thing that inspires you to leave, also is going to have a very limited spread. There's a long history of this community-based surveillance and censorship, and again, when you're doing SD card to SD card kind of changing of devices and they're being confiscated and they're being monitored, the ability to spread a South Korean pop video that's awesome and is just interesting to watch, which may have a high level of sanctions, versus something with a similar level of sanctions that is boring and and the like, really does impact how it's going to spread throughout. And more importantly, also, if you have a USB stick with 13 things that are going to get you put in jail and 3 South Korean pop videos, I guarantee you those 13 things are going off that USB drive real quick. And we're going to keep those 3 pop videos.
Well, and to add one final thing to that, too, it's always interesting to me to see what people notice on the margins of things like entertainment. You know, there's always those famous stories of the North Koreans seeing, Nodong Shinmun, like official newspaper coverage of protests in South Korea, and the message they take away is not, oh, the South Koreans are mad at their government. The message they take away is like, oh, those are some nice jackets. Like, things seem all right there.
I think just to add to kind of the last 2 questions, if you could talk a little bit about, I know we focused today mostly on digital media and the digitization, but there is still obviously a role for radio, and you do go over it in the report. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit now about the differentiation and maybe the demographic differences as well as to how radio is used versus digital media.
Sure, and I mean, I think that's an important thing to keep in mind too. If we are looking at the information environment from kind of an environment perspective, that these new kind of devices and technological innovations are very interesting, but there are still some things that radio is quite unique in, and to some degree, like broadcast TV can be as well, in terms of real-time, nationally available sources of specifically targeted outside news and information. Scratchy shortwave radio doesn't have the kind of aesthetic, viewer-listener experience that highly produced South Korean drama does. But for someone who is like plugged in enough and interested enough in what's going on in real time and wants kind of dense news and information, radio really is remains the only option, the only really feasible option. And radio, as we kind of saw in some of the device access, it remains relatively stable, even as we've seen kind of broad expansions in some of these new media devices. And so we haven't seen a kind of drastic substitution effect away from that. That said, it also is somewhat more demographically limited than things that are more kind of entertainment, broad appeal. Radio listeners tend to be kind of middle-aged guys who are a little better educated.
Hi, Dan Wirtz, National Committee on North Korea. To what extent has the North Korean government responded to the changing information environment in the country by introducing and allowing more interesting, useful media of its own, such as better produced TV shows, allowing in more very carefully vetted and harmless foreign movies, having more interesting things on the intranet, like I think games like Angry Birds you mentioned? And are there carrots that it's using to keep people within the state-controlled information environment as well as sticks to keep them from moving outside of it?
This is a super fascinating question to me because it seems like that would be a very natural thing for them to focus on. It has been a stick parade thus far. There's not been as much on the carrot side as one might expect. Certainly, we can find examples to the contrary. I mean, kind of like famously cited the Moranbong Band, who's kind of like, ooh, scantily clad, like more modern performances. And you know, we've seen in the Kim Jong-un era a little bit more kind of, you know, opening up to new kinds of kind of cultural that's being broadcast a little more widely. But talking to folks who monitor the domestic media much more kind of closely and consistently than the changes seem to be relatively subtle. So we haven't seen a massive focus on let's reinvent kind of domestic media to be kind of a rich place so they don't have to go somewhere else, even if we have seen some kind of, you know, marginal changes.
So I think as maybe a final question then, I wonder if I can ask you guys. So obviously there's a lot of information here and you guys have poured over this over and over. And I think the question for us now is, you know, what is the takeaway for policymakers and for funders as to how to use this information? How should they use this to direct programming in the future? But also what not to do in that process.
Yeah, I think that is a really smart framing of the question, actually, because there certainly is a lot of kind of potential, a lot of things that can be done on kind of the informational front, and I'm encouraged that I think the North Korean issue now is being viewed a little bit more broadly than simply kind of missiles and nukes. And there certainly are things that people can do, both in terms of supporting some of the kind of ongoing activities that we know work and that aren't susceptible to some of these new technological innovations, but then also continuing to monitor the situation and, you know, taking a good hard look at how do we start to build nascent capacity amongst North Koreans to be able to respond to these challenges, because it's going to require a long-term output. There's definitely not a kind of silver bullet in something like this. Tack on?
Yeah, to reiterate again, that capacity building component of this. Right now, as I was talking about the surveillance infrastructure and then, you know, utilizing essentially technology and the challenges of these kind of tech battles that are happening outside of North Korea, the internal capacity to respond is limited. And I think that by supporting the existing secondary economies and information ecosystems and kind of bringing that information in is an incredibly valuable tool to help build up their ability to engage in that tech surveillance and censorship infrastructure on their own ways, to adapt and build new strategies and new techniques without trying to force external interventions of we're going to crack all the phones that we find and we're going to do all this stuff and we're going to drone them in and drop them on. Like, I think that when you are facing a battle with an external adversary, and by external adversary I mean external interventions into North Korea around technology without building the internal capacity of the citizenry to also build up their ability to respond and to engage in a much more comprehensive way with the technological constraints that they have, it leads to an unsustainable system where there is an adversarial relationship that's advancing very quickly, and then a core member of that who's being served or not served by that adversarial relationship, who is actually lagging far behind and is unable to kind of pick up that baton and move.
The 2 points is number one is I think as you talk to policymakers and all and funders and all, the good news is there can be information getting into North Korea. I think the second point is it gets back to content, and it's what I talked about to begin with, and I think the content needs to be focused on looking at trying to talk to North Koreans about what should their future be like. What is the rest of the world? What should you be demanding? And then here's how support you'll be able to do in order to be able to get to that position. And as I said in my talk, until we can better define, we in South Korea and China and others, really what is the future for North Korean people in either a changed regime or a reunified peninsula, it's going to be very hard to get that information in.
Great. Well, thank you to Nat and Seamus and General Sharp. The report will also be available on the Intermedia website as well as our website, U.S. Korea Institute, on this event page. So in the future, you can forward it to your friends and your colleagues and policymakers and funders to make sure it gets widespread readership, because this is a very important topic. And the information dynamics are changing as we are changing rapidly. Well, not rapidly. They're changing, for sure. And it's changing the way we look at North Korean society. So please help me in thanking our speakers today.